Hello everyone, welcome to Open Line. Glad you're with us. We are talking tonight about the push in the legislature to build more juvenile detention facilities. What does that mean? How much will it cost? Why are we doing that? What is the impact? There is an organization we've talked to before, Disability Rights Tennessee, that has some concerns about that has some thoughts on some other things we could be doing. And so that's what we're going to kind of delve into tonight. I'm very happy to have with us Zoe Jamail with Disability Rights Tennessee. Thank you for being here.
Yes, thank you for having me.
I've interviewed you a few times. You've been on the show a few times. We appreciate you coming on. So let's big picture Disability Rights Tennessee. What is Disability Rights Tennessee?
Yeah, so Disability Rights Tennessee is the state's protection and advocacy agency for people with disabilities. We have legal and advocacy services for any person in Tennessee with any type of disability. And
you have remarkable access as a result of your what would it be, charter. As a result of the way you're organized, you can go into facilities. I can't go in there, but you can go into juvenile detention facilities and look at how they're doing. And so talk about that, and why do you do that? Why are you focused on that issue?
Sure. So we do have a federal mandate to monitor facilities where people with disabilities may reside or receive services. And so we do regular monitoring of facilities across the state, and those do include juvenile justice facilities, and it's because there is a really substantial population of young people with disabilities within juvenile detention centers and other hardware secure facilities in particular. And that's what we discovered when we started monitoring Wilder Youth Development Center back in 2020. Almost 80% of the young people in that facility that we interviewed had a disability under the Americans with Disabilities Act. And so, and that sort of started our path on monitoring, a lot of the other juvenile detention centers in the state. And then we have been, sort of advocating for change within those facilities to make the conditions better, but also raising questions about, how can we look at alternatives to institutionalization of young people, or, what is essentially incarceration when we're talking about hardware secure facilities.
Yeah, Wilder is one that has gotten a lot of attention, and that's kind of the biggest of the facilities. Mm-hmm. Most hardware secure, that kind of thing. So what are you seeing up at the legislature now? You're up there a lot. Mm-hmm. Disability Rights Tennessee is up there a lot. What are some of the proposals that you're seeing and maybe you're concerned about, or just what are you seeing right now?
So I'll say one of the things that came out of the Joint Ad Hoc Committee on Juvenile Justice, which was it was within our legislature back in 2022 is when that Joint Ad Hoc Committee was called, shortly after we released the report on Wilder Youth Development Center. And coming out of that committee was a DCS real estate plan. One of the recommendations was for them to look at the facilities that we currently have and to create a plan for how we can make those facilities better. But unfortunately, the state's focus really turned to building more facilities, and so there's now a $400 million plan to build a variety of facilities. So they're building a new Wilder Youth Development Center, they're building, which is a hardware secure facility, and then they're building some assessment and intake centers, which there will be 9 of those across the state. We're not exactly sure what they will look like because we don't currently have any of them in our state. But those are the facilities that they are talking about building at this point. And I think, one of the problems with those facilities is how incredibly expensive they are. So Wilder Youth Development Center costs over $1,600 per youth per day. That's almost $600,000 per youth per year. And so
that's an astounding number, $600,000 a year for each child in there, each
yes.
youth, each juvenile in there.
Yes, and what our organization is trying to advocate for is, investing that those funds, instead of investing them in facilities, investing them in strengthening families, connecting young people to their communities and resources within those communities, so that when they go into the juvenile justice system or exit the juvenile justice system, that they are sort of supported and that they have successful re-entry into those communities. And then finally, we're also talking about making the facilities that we do have and any future facilities safer, because right now there is sort of, what we're really, the plan that we have sort of laid out in our latest report is to create more oversight, and maybe from an independent body rather than having the Department of Children's Services provide all of that oversight, or looking at our licensing scheme, because a lot of our facilities are unlicensed, and so when something happens at that facility, or when that facility is non-compliant with the rules and regulations that they are supposed to abide by, then the Department of Children's Services really doesn't have any recourse, because they don't have a license to revoke. So we've been talking about some solutions, and that's what our latest report is really about. And
solutions, because kids that are in this system will get out. Kids aren't going to be in there for life.
Right.
So in some cases, there are some serious crimes here, and that needs to be dealt with, but they aren't going to be in there for life. And what are you seeing as far as the recidivism rate? Is our current system successful, in your opinion?
So it really depends what we're talking about. Most young people who are committed to the Department of Children's Services, the longest that they will be in a juvenile justice facility is until the age of 19. Now that looks different if they are transferred to the adult system. That's a different case. But when we're talking about young people who are within the Department of Children's Services and committed to one of their facilities, they will be released into the community at 19. And that's why it is so important to really strengthen the families that they're going back home to and connect them to the resources in the community that they'll go back home to. Now, we're talking about other proposals in the legislature, and one of those proposals is a blended sentencing and mandatory transfer scheme. And so blended sentencing can look very different. There are lots of different states that have blended sentencing laws, and what it allows a court to do is to basically have a young person who serves the juvenile portion of their sentence, and then at some point a court makes a determination about whether or not the young person needs additional time in most often in the adult system. But the blended sentencing scheme that's been proposed this year is problematic in a lot of ways, and one of the main ways that it's problematic is that it doesn't offer a jury trial or any discretion for a judge when it comes to whether or not to sentence a young person as a serious youthful offender. That's what it's called. And so that's always concerning when we see something where the legislature is taking discretion away from a judge to consider extenuating circumstances, and really ties the court's hands in terms of what rehabilitative services the court can provide for the young person.
What we're seeing this year are a lot of bills that would potentially keep kids locked up longer. Is that right?
Yes.
That is certainly one of them. And we're building the facilities to keep them locked up longer. And there might be some out there that say, okay, great, we need to lock people up more. What would you say to that? I mean, I'm sure there's some situations that call for that, but are you concerned about a blanket answer of let's build very expensive things and lock kids up longer?
Yeah, and you asked about recidivism earlier, and one of the things that we know is that contact with the adult system and incarceration in adult facilities actually leads to more recidivism. Young people who are prosecuted in adult court and go to adult facilities are 30% more likely to reoffend than if they were to stay in the juvenile justice system. And that's because the juvenile justice system was created to protect and rehabilitate youth. There are certain services services that in theory exist in that system that don't exist in the adult system. And also young people are subject to a much higher risk of abuse in adult facilities. The risks for suicide are higher. There's a lot of things that happen in adult facilities to young people just by virtue of them being younger. And so we really think that the focus should be on the provision of services and supports, not only to the young person, but to the young person's family. And for the reasons that we talked about earlier, because they will be returning home to that family and to those communities. And, you know, when we talk about families with young people who come into the juvenile justice system, most often those families are already overloaded and overburdened. 86% of young people who are in the juvenile justice system have had prior contact with the Department of Children's Services on the dependent or neglected side. And so that tells us that the families are already struggling, that they need services and support and resources to help care for their child, to, you know, and one of the things about the juvenile justice system is that it really is an opportunity to wrap those families up and provide them with services. Can you imagine what a family could do with the $600,000 a year that we're paying to keep their child at Wilder Youth Development Center? I mean, if just a fraction of that were used to provide therapeutic services or education or, you know, a variety of resources to that family. One of the things that we hear about with, you know, young people with disabilities is that post-COVID, we have seen an increase in the number of young people with autism who are coming into custody of the Department of Children's Services on the dependent or neglected side. And it's not because their families are abusing or neglecting them, it's because they don't have the resources at their home or in the community to care for them, and they think that the only way their young person can get the resources and the treatment and services that they need is if they relinquish custody to the department.
Wow. Yeah, that's very difficult. And the department has been in the news a lot. It's a huge department. It takes care of foster kids. It takes care of dependent neglect kids. These are kids that have been neglected and are removed from homes or leave for the reason you just said. Then it's also juvenile justice. So it's all kids, but you have two different sets of kids here. Do you think DCS is the appropriate entity to oversee both of those things? Should they be doing juvenile justice and abuse and neglect and dependent neglect kids, in your opinion?
I think it's a hard question to answer. I think that with the right approach to the young people in their custody, yes, I think that they are the right entity to be overseeing both of those systems. However, when we, you know, talk about dependent or neglected children one way, and then we talk about our young people in the juvenile justice system in another, that becomes, I think, where we start to make mistakes. And really, these are young people who just need support and they need help, and that is the role that the department is supposed to play in both, you know, both areas that they oversee. And
some lawmakers have said there is a lot of crime. We need to do more to combat that kind of crime. And we've had some people on the show that have questioned that. But what are we seeing as far as juvenile crime right now in Tennessee?
Yeah, so I think last time I was on here, we talked about how youth crime in Tennessee has been on a steady decline for the past 10+ years. There was a I think, you know, there is a perception that crime is up, and the numbers just don't, that's not what the numbers say. So what
happens is crime is up if you take it from the pandemic. So in the pandemic year, it went down because everybody was in their house.
Right.
And so if you say, well, the last 4 years crime's way up, that would be true, but if you look at the 10-year, it's actually going down.
Yeah, and it was really just that 1 year. So the reporting in 2020, yes, you're correct, it was down, but from the 10 years prior, it was like this, and then it just went up a tiny bit in 2021, and then it went right back down. So it's not that like since 2020 it's been on the rise. It was just that 1 year, 2021, because of the steep decline that we saw in 2020. But every year since, youth crime has been on the decline. So it really was that year was just an oddity in terms of reporting, or that, yes, what you said, people were in their homes and, you know, not getting into as much trouble. But even in Memphis and like Shelby County and Davidson County, youth crime is still down. Now I think there has been an increase in certain age groups, but it is not the under 18 and under. That is not the age group where we are seeing an increase in crime.
And that's not to minimize the fact that there are crimes. But
right.
What you are saying is that we don't need to overreact. There are things that need to be done.
Correct.
And there's serious things out there.
Yes.
And they need to be addressed. And it's a question of how do we do that?
Right.
Do we lock more of them up longer? Or is there another approach that maybe has some of that but not all of that? Is that right? Or?
Yes, absolutely. And you know, if we are going to explore you know, blended sentencing or mandatory transfers, I think the important thing is looking at how do we preserve judicial discretion so that a court can, you know, our juvenile court judges really are in the best position to, you know, assess a young person and what that young person needs. They are the ones who are seeing them. And so anytime that there is an attempt to incarcerate youth for longer, but to remove the judge's discretion to consider extenuating circumstances, which, you know, for example, in this blended sentencing bill, there are 5 factors, and if a young person fails 3 of the factors, then they automatically have to go into the adult portion of their sentence. There is no discretion for the judge to say, oh, well, this young person has cancer, and by virtue of them having cancer, they have failed to meet all 3 of these factors because they can't graduate high school, they're in a hospital getting treatment, they can't do X, Y, and Z, and so therefore the court's hands are tied. They have no way to say, I'm not going to send this young person to the adult system. They would have to, under the language of the bill that is moving through our legislature right now. Which
would lead to a lot more kids in the adult system. Mm-hmm. All right, we are going to take a break. That sets the table for our discussion. If you want to call in, there's a number, 615-737-PLUS, 615-737-7587. We'll take a break. Be back right after this. Welcome back, everyone, to Open Line. Glad you're with us. We are talking about, well, with Disability Rights Tennessee's Zoe Jamail is with us, and a bunch of bills in the legislature that deal with juvenile justice, juvenile crime. How do we handle it? We kind of set the table in the first segment there, but there are some good bills. So you're up there at the legislature how often? 3 days a week?
Usually, yes. That's been typical recently.
So 3 days a week you're up there, you're monitoring all these bills. There's some that you're concerned about, but there's some that you think are good bills, right? And so let's talk about those. Yeah.
So I think that there are some very worrisome proposals out there, certainly, but there are some good ones that we, you know, think would lead to safer facilities in the state of Tennessee. Now, while our organization thinks that the best way to keep young people safe is to keep them out of facilities, if we are going to have facilities, we want them to be facilities that provide evidence-based services and that really prioritize full schedules for young people and adequate programming and facilities that are fully staffed. And that was another thing that came out of the Joint Ad Hoc Committee on Juvenile Justice. They really took a look at how they could increase the staffing levels at places like Wilder, because one of the things that we found there was that, you know, Wilder was very understaffed, and so that does lead to issues with young people, because if a place is understaffed and they're not receiving the programming that they should, they're spending a lot of time locked up in their rooms when really they should be able to access education services or therapies or other rehabilitative programming. But some of the good bills that we are, I guess, excited about, or proposals, relate to additional oversight of facilities, and also looking at, you know, more transparency. So one of the things that we find troublesome within the state is that there's no licensing registry for the facilities that the Department of Children's Services uses, and they do use unlicensed settings often. So, you know, you've done a lot of reporting on transition houses. Transition houses are not licensed, and so if a transition house is doing something that it's not supposed to, or not complying with, you know, the rules and regulations that apply to other licensed facilities, there's no recourse for the Department of Children's Services. They can't like revoke the license because there's no license to revoke. And that goes for juvenile detention centers that are run by the county across the state as well. There's an exemption in our state code that says DCS doesn't have to license those facilities. And so when you have problems like what we've seen reporting on at the Knox County Juvenile Detention Center, the Bean Center, there's no license to revoke. And so while the Department of Children's Services approves that facility and also you know, contracts with that facility to place young people there, it doesn't have any enforcement mechanism, really.
That, I mean, I've done a lot of stories about transitional homes, and we can talk about that in a minute. That's more, those homes are more for abused and neglected kids, and that's to keep kids from sleeping in offices. That report about the, what is the Bean Center, is that it? That is a juvenile detention facility, and is it privately owned? It's
run by the county. It's not privately owned.
The 83-year-old person that runs it just got, he just said all kinds of things about how they treat kids. Like, yeah, they're in solitary confinement, and yes, this and that. And it was all inappropriate, but he just didn't seem to care, and and then you go to DCS, and DCS says what?
Basically, we can't do anything. And there is one enforcement mechanism in our state code that would allow DCS to file a complaint against a facility that is not licensed, and they just haven't used that enforcement mechanism.
So that's a county-run facility. There are a lot of privately run facilities.
Yes.
And the situation there also, I did several reports about solitary confinement a few years ago. The legislature was very concerned that we're finding kids that are staying in their cells 23 hours, they're out for 1, they're in there by themselves. The very definition of solitary confinement, the legislature changed to do away with that. But we still see it happening. Is that right? And why is it still happening? And I think even the legislature would be frustrated by that.
Yeah, I think part of the problem is the not having a license to revoke. So when you have a facility that's non-compliant, and you, as DCS, the entity that is licensing similarly situated facilities, but you don't have a license to revoke, then there's no incentive for the facility to actually comply with the rules and regulations that, in theory, they are supposed to be complying with. I think the seclusion issue in particular, when that law was passed, part of the problem is that it does allow for, it did limit seclusion to 2 hours at a time, and then 6 hours within a 24-hour period. But facilities
that you would be in your cell, right?
Yes.
2 hours at a time, and then 6 hours, I guess, at night. You need to sleep. Because they were spending 23 hours with 1 hour out.
Right, and that's so the sleep time doesn't count under the statute,
okay,
because for sleep purposes, that's something that applies to the entire population, and so that's different from actual seclusion. But when we talk about seclusion, we're talking about like what you're saying with solitary confinement, but it's like limited in time under our law now. However, there is a part of that code section that basically says if the young person cannot safely be returned to the general population, then the department can come up with a rule or policy for how to you know, how to treat that young person, like what should happen at that point. But there hasn't been a rule or policy that the department has put forth, and so I think there is confusion within some of the facilities, and so they're just coming up with their own solution when they determine that a young person can't safely be returned. But what we were seeing at like the Bean Detention Center was, you know, basically the young people were staying in their cells for hours on end, and there's just, you know, some type of workaround that certain facilities are using to go around the seclusion statute.
What do you think about, and maybe there's no other way, the fact that so many of these facilities are privately owned? Is that unusual? Do you see that in other states? Is that a good model? Is that a model you'd like to see change?
So I don't know about nationally. I do know that when our juvenile justice system was created here in Tennessee, there were no privately owned facilities for young people that were coming into DCS custody and being placed in a facility. There were only detention centers, which were typically for pre-adjudication, holding a young person temporarily prior to their hearing on the petition for delinquency. And then there were post-adjudication facilities, which were youth development centers. But now we only have one state-run youth development center, and we have, you know, juvenile detention centers, which DCS also contracts with for post-adjudication placement, and then we have privately owned juvenile detention centers and hardware secure residential child care agencies is what they're, some of the other privately owned ones are licensed as. And so we are seeing sort of this movement toward creating different kinds of facilities, and the hardware secure residential child care agency is something that was just recently defined in DCS's rules and regulations, but it is not defined in our state code. So it's a little bit, we're kind of entering new territory when we talk about licensing a facility that way. It's not something that we've done in the past. Those facilities have existed, but just have been essentially licensed improperly. And so that's problematic because we have hardware secure facilities that are juvenile detention centers, and then we have Wilder, which is a youth development center, which sort of stands on its own, and then we have these hardware secure residential child care agencies, and they all have different rules and policies that apply to them.
And hardware secure, that means they're locked in a cell.
It's like a prison.
Yeah,
yes,
that's what that means. And so should we move away from the private part of it, or because I wonder how much influence the private owners have on the rules that have never been passed, or whatever it is. That might mean we have to build more. I don't know, but should we move away, in your opinion, from the private, or not? I
think that, you know, it is a good thing to have a Department of Children's Services that is overseeing all of these things. And so whether or not it is private or public, I think is up for debate. I don't know necessarily that I can say one way or another which is better, but I will say what is important is having independent oversight, because there is, you know, for the Department of Children's Services, they need the beds that these facilities provide. So they are, it's hard for them to want to shut a facility down when they're non-compliant. Which
they really can't afford it.
Right.
Because they don't have another place to put the kids.
Right. And which goes back to, you know, what you were asking about some of the proposals in the legislature that we're seeing that would probably be good for the juvenile justice system. So one of the things that we're seeing is a licensing registry that would be publicly available and would let us know what facilities exist, how they're licensed or not licensed, and if there are any, you know, non-compliance issues. That would be publicly available information, and I think that that would be really good for our state and for the safety of the young people in facilities, because right now it's really hard to access that information. Another thing that would be really great is looking at maybe how do we increase the independence of licensing and enforcement within DCS. Like, should it be another entity that is in charge charge of licensing these facilities and enforcing compliance so that there's not this sort of, I don't know, difficulty in determining whether or not it is actually a good thing for DCS to shut down a non-compliant facility or to stop contracting with them at the very least. And then, another thing that we are seeing, there's a proposal to codify the Tennessee Commission on Children and Youth. They have an ombudsman program which essentially acts as a liaison for young people, between young people in the system, either foster care, dependent or neglected, or in the juvenile justice system, and DCS. And its goal is to solve problems and issues. And right now that program exists, and it has since 1996, but it's not actually codified in our code. And so there is a proposal to codify the ombudsman program and to give that program a little bit of independent oversight in some of these facilities, to allow them to monitor and inspect in the same way that DCS does, and to also make recommendations when they see a facility that's non-compliant, that DCS would then, have to look at, and there are some enforcement mechanisms within that proposal.
It seems like
well.
more oversight's a good idea. DCS, it's well documented. They've struggled on all kinds of fronts. They have a lot on their plate, and so more oversight might be a good thing. You guys, Disability Rights Tennessee, you can go. Can you go inside the one in Knoxville?
Yes, and we've been in there. Mm-hmm.
So you can go in there and you can write up reports, and you did that at Wilder, and you're doing that. But I then say, so this ombudsman, is there a chance that's really going to pass? I mean, are you optimistic?
I think it could. We'll see. You never know with this legislature, but I think that you're right that we've seen a lot of issues with DCS oversight of the facilities that it does license or approve and or contract with. And so I think it would be, right now there may be more appetite than in the past to have some type of independent oversight for those facilities, because we're seeing a lot of problems, and we're also seeing that DCS is saying, well, we can't do anything about it because we don't actually license them. So this would provide not only some independent oversight, but also an enforcement mechanism for, forcing compliance.
And so again, I think oversight's a good idea. All right, we're gonna take a break, and then I want to ask. So I've done a bunch of stories about transitional homes. These are homes that were set up last year or so to keep kids from having to sleep in offices, which they certainly should not be sleeping in offices. So that's a good thing, and they're set up so that they have a place to stay. But there's some tough things going on there, and so we'll talk about that and talk about what Disability Rights Tennessee is doing. We'll take a break. Come back right after this. Welcome back, everyone, to Open Line. We are talking with Zoe Jamail with Disability Rights Tennessee. We're talking about, now we're going to talk about transitional homes at the Department of Children's Services. I've done a few stories on these transitional homes. As I said going to break, they were set up to keep kids from sleeping in offices. It was tragic. Kids were sleeping in offices because there was no foster home for them. So while they waited to get into a foster home, they would stay in an office. These are kids that have been taken out of an abusive or neglected situation. These are not kids that have committed a crime. And so they were sleeping in offices. Then they set up these transitional homes. And we have found there were DCS employees that have said there are serious problems inside these homes. We saw kids getting handcuffed. They've expanded the handcuffing policy because they say kids are acting out. And so there are all of these issues that are at play in these transitional homes. You all have gone, Disability Rights Tennessee has gone inside of Wilder, and you've done reports. What are you thinking about what you're seeing with transitional homes? Are you thinking of going inside them and kind of monitoring them, or where are you right now?
I don't think we've decided if we are going into transition homes at this time. It's unclear what the long-term plan for transition housing is. Transition housing is not something that exists in our state code. It doesn't exist in DCS's rules and regulations. There are no rules or regulations that apply to these houses, and that's part of the problem, I think, and why anytime there's unlicensed care happening, we question whether that is the best route, because again, when you have problems within these houses, just like when you have problems within any unlicensed setting, there is no mechanism to enforce compliance. And in this case, there are no rules or regulations to even hold the transition houses to a standard, you know, and that's why we have rules and regulations. We have them to create standards and requirements that certain, you know, settings must meet. And
it's interesting. I'm just going to jump in.
Yeah.
I mean, the one I did a story on here in Davidson County is run by DCS, but many of these others it's a church that is just kind of stepping up and helping because
Yes.
they've seen the kids are sleeping in offices, and so you appreciate that.
Yes.
But at the same time, they're getting kids. They're kids with lots of acute issues, and maybe they're not equipped to handle them. And then you have security guards in there that have the authority to handcuff them. And it sounds like a very difficult situation.
Yes, and I do think that it's, you know, you're correct that there's only one DCS-run transition house, and the rest are, I think there are about 30 of them throughout the state, and they are all nonprofits or churches that are basically lending their space to DCS for DCS to use to temporarily house young people, and that is the goal is that the housing is temporary while DCS finds a more permanent placement for the young person. But the problem with any type of temporary housing or temporary facility is that it will fill up if you're not investing in, you know, more long-term placements. And when we're talking about foster kids and young people on the dependent or neglected side, the best place to place those young people is with families. And there are certainly things that DCS could be doing to invest in families and support families so that they are, you know, whether it's increasing the number of families who come into the foster care system and want to be foster parents, or doing more searching for relative caregivers or kinship caregivers, looking for other supportive adults in the young person's life who might be willing to take that young person in for a time. They're typically, even when a young person is coming from a really you know, difficult circumstance at home, there are typically adults in that young person's life who may be willing to take that child in on a temporary basis. Even if they're not willing to foster the child long term, there are other settings besides these transition houses that we could be looking into that might be better for the young people. Young people, no matter who they are or what they've done, they need families, and that really is the best place for them. And I think when, yes, there are young people who have, you know, committed heinous crimes, and oftentimes they need more rehabilitative services in an environment that's more controlled and more supervised. I'm not denying that, but I think for the most part, the young people, especially on the dependent or neglected side, who are coming into the foster care system, they could be with families. It's just I'm not sure that the state is doing everything that it could to seek out those families. And we need to be doing everything we can to encourage foster care to come forward. We lost a lot of foster care families in the pandemic. The goal is to keep kids in the transitional home a couple of days, and then they go off to a foster family. That would be the ideal. Kids are staying there much longer. Yes. The commissioner has said that she is trying to transform DCS, upgrade it, modernize it. The DCS is built for 30, 40 years ago, and things are very different now. What do you say when you hear that? And where do you think we need to be putting our attention? You've kind of laid it out, but what do you say when the commissioner says that? Yeah, I think there's been a tendency, whenever we've seen problems within the department, there's been a tendency to say, oh, it's the kids. Well, these kids are much different than they were 30 years ago, and we haven't seen this many kids with this many issues ever before. And I'm not so sure that that's the reality. I think that what maybe the approach should be a little bit different, and looking at you know, how do we support these young people and really give them the things that they need instead of just looking at them as young people to place in a facility somewhere? Because the reality is a lot of the funds that we are using, that DCS is asking for and using, are going toward residential placements. It's not going into developing more foster families or incentivizing people to become foster parents. It's going toward out-of-state residential placements, which, you know, those are so problematic because when the goal of foster care, usually the goal is reunification with the biological family. And when you send a young person out of state because they have disabilities or, you know, otherwise, you are cutting them off from the family that you are trying to reunify with them. Like that is ultimately the goal in most dependent or neglected cases. And so I think anytime that we're looking at how much DCS is spending on those residential placements, we automatically think, what would be a better use of that money? And oftentimes the answer is investing in and supporting families. And, you know, I talked a little bit before about how some of the young people who are coming into the foster care system who have disabilities, whether that's intellectual disability or other developmental disabilities, or mental illness that qualifies as a disability, those young people, really, their families are at a point where they feel like they can't, there's nothing that they can do. And what they're really asking for is for support and resources from the department. And when the department can't give them that in the home, then the young person, that's when they relinquish custody in a lot of cases. And so when we talk about how much money the department is asking for these residential foster care placements, what would be a better use of that money? Would it, you know, investing in foster families, incentivizing foster families with some type of credit like that goes beyond. And when we talk about relative caregivers and kinship caregivers, sometimes they're not given the boarding rate that a foster family would. And so how can we incentivize more relative caregivers and kinship caregivers? What kind of, you know, vouchers could we use for them to really put young people who can safely remain in homes, and then also biological families when there is no abuse in the home, but they are just feeling overloaded and asking for help. There's a lot of money going toward taking young people out of homes and putting them into the foster care system. And Governor Lee actually said when the Department of Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities raised this issue of young people coming into custody post-pandemic on the foster care side, and it's young people with disabilities, and Governor Lee seemed shocked and he said, why are we doing that? That's a terrible idea. It costs the state a lot more money to put them into foster care than to give the services that the family needs. And we agree. So
that's part of it.
Yeah.
Quickly, all right, one of the things they've done is they now allow handcuffing of dependent neglected kids. Again, saying that these kids are acting up to such a degree, they're destroying property, they're hurting the people that are working there, they're hurting each other. So never before has that been allowed at DCS. You could only handcuff juvenile justice kids that have had those kind of issues. Now it's dependent neglect. What do you think about that, and what does that say about where things are going?
Yeah, I mean, that policy in itself is so problematic, and I think it's really a result of you know, putting young people into environments that don't have any programming, don't have any schedule, really. I mean, these young people, they're brought into these transition houses, and you know, they're meant to be very short-term, very temporary, but that's not what's happening. And so I use the analogy of, you know, if you're we can think of like a transition home like a layover if you're on a flight, right? And your tolerance for the length of time that your layover is really depends on where you are. Like if you're on the plane and you're not allowed to get off the plane, you're in a highly restrictive setting, you're not going to tolerate that situation for very long. And I think that that's what's happening in a lot of cases when we're hearing that young people are running away from the transition houses. Well, yes, of course, they're being held in a place where they don't get to talk to family. They're not around anyone that they know. They're being watched over by sitter services and security guards in one of the arguably the most traumatic time of their life. And so that is really problematic. And just to, you know, put a point on this, like there's another proposal that, you know, allowing the handcuffing of young people is really terrible, but there's another proposal that would allow DCS to place young people who have been adjudicated as dependent or neglected into juvenile justice facilities. This is a bill that is moving through the legislature right now, and that is highly concerning when we're talking about young people who are coming into foster care, essentially. Like they are being put into the foster care system by our juvenile courts, and DCS is saying, well, we want the ability, without court intervention, without an order from the court, to be able to put that young person into a juvenile justice facility.
All right, we have to take a break. We will come back, continue our discussion. We'll be back right after this. So we just have a minute left in this segment here, kind of wrapping everything up. So we've talked about transitional homes, we've talked about juvenile justice facilities, detention facilities, all this stuff. What do you want people to take away?
I think the takeaway today is really that all youth, whether they are on the dependent or neglected side or on the juvenile justice side, need families. All families need support in times of crisis, and I think the state could really be doing a better job, or at least investing more funds into strengthening families and giving them the support that they need in times when they are overburdened. I think one of the things, especially that we see with the juvenile justice system, is that it creates barriers to parenting and really puts more burden on families. So I think that would be the takeaway.
All right, we will wrap everything up. We'll take one more break. We'll come back, wrap everything up right after this.